Heat is the movie that made me into a movie person. You wouldn't really guess that from the sort of things I watch now, from the sort of things I review on this channel, but Heat is what first lit the fire. Obviously, this is a great movie, and it was a big part of my life, but I wasn't sure that I was going to like it this time around. Would it just seem full of gratuity? I don't mean people giving generous tips. Would it be full of bravado? Is it too long? I wondered also whether I would have anything interesting to say about this movie. Is it just an action movie, or is there some analysis to be done? Well, I'll try to answer all of those questions in this video. This is a famous movie, so I'm not going to talk through the cast or the trivia of the production. You can go look up all that kind of information. The one thing I will say is that the cast in this movie is big. A lot of people maybe think of Heat as the one with Pacino and De Niro. But don't forget about Jon Voight, Val Kilmer, Natalie Portman, Hank Azaria. Actually, they both kind of suck in this movie, so maybe you do want to forget those two. Overall, the cast is really good, and it's bigger than you might remember. I also really like the music in this movie. It's slightly in the danger zone of being dated, which in truth, the whole movie maybe is a little bit, but I think it survives. The music really takes Heat to the next level. I remember listening to the soundtrack just for fun after I saw this movie. I think I watched it as a freshman in high school. It really started my film obsession, and I had the soundtrack in iTunes, and I would listen to it for fun. This time, when I watched the movie, I was able to place it within a network of other movies in a way that I couldn't do the first time I saw it. Plenty of people have talked about this movie has influenced The Dark Knight, I guess. The movie that I kept thinking of was Crash, the new one. Although the old Crash came out just after Heat, and I think it's worth talking about that as well. I'll come back to those, but some interesting influence here. In the 1990s, there were a lot of movies with sort of a boardroom fixation, seemingly grappling with the images of high-powered capitalists. It might not seem like it at first, but I think that Heat is kind of a kindred spirit to something like American Psycho. It's kind of a corporate movie. And not just because there's one crooked businessman in it. There's a bunch of little things that make me think this. For instance, Robert De Niro wears a suit, and he acts like an executive, always on the phone. He wears a suit, even though he's a criminal, and he's not a white-collar criminal. Al Pacino also wears a suit. Of course, detectives, they do wear suits. But it's still kind of interesting that this cops versus robbers movie ends up being about two guys who look and act like they could be on the board of directors. Look at how they struggle to strike a work-life balance. In some ways, you might expect a thief, a criminal, not to have this conundrum of work-life balance. I mean, is it work? I don't know, but he seems, again, like an executive, like this corporate person, like a company man, and he struggles to balance his personal life and his corporate agenda. I don't think either Vincent or Neil could maintain a YouTube channel with weekly uploads. Neil frequently says things like, if you want to walk, walk right now, or choose on your own to stay with me. This is an interesting look at personal responsibility, and again, it sounds maybe like something Patrick Bateman might say. So strangely, Heat kind of feels like a corporate movie really at home in the 90s. The biggest thing that reminds me of this other 90s stuff, though, is simply how much bravado the movie has. We see time and time again Neil and Vincent both wielding power that comes from where? Comes from being big personalities. They do have some actual power. They do have guns, but a lot of their authority is conjured through bravado. When I was thinking about returning to this movie, my main question was whether all this shouting and shooting was going to be interesting to me, or if this was just going to seem like a movie with too much testosterone. Now, I can hear you saying that this movie doesn't celebrate machismo. Maybe it's a cautionary tale about character flaws or flaws in society more generally. This is a harsh movie, and maybe that's the point. I'm sort of on the fence about this. Heat is a very gritty film full of violence. It's visceral and unyielding, so you wouldn't really call it glamorous. But on the other hand, I wouldn't really call it incisive. Now, I'm not going to tell you that this movie should be calling out toxic masculinity. In fact, it kind of tries to contrive its way towards this already by showing how Vincent and Neil's home life deteriorates. It already kind of has a little bit of a moralistic undertone, although, of course, at the same time, it does make them look pretty cool, and neither one of these guys actually makes amends for anything. Neil is punished ultimately for seeking revenge, not for not focusing on his family life and such, right? So they kind of get off the hook. I'm not saying this should be a moralistic movie, though, I guess what I'm really trying to get at here is that I think if there's one criticism of Heat, it would be that it's pointless. And not just pointless, but that it invokes some really heavy stuff, some grim violence. And to what end? Well, maybe for no reason. Okay, do I really think that? Not entirely, but like I said, if there's one thing you might criticize the movie for, that would probably be it. In some ways, yeah, it seems like a very adult movie, a very legit movie because it's so, intense, because it's so gritty. But what's the point? Honestly, though, when I saw this movie, I spent the first half thinking that it was too loud. But the second half, I think it balances it out. And overall, the movie is so staggering, so visceral, that by the time you get to the end, you kind of forget anything you might have thought earlier. Okay, also, I thought the roles for women in this movie are terrible, really poorly written, and it's your textbook tokenization. But hey, the director is named Michael Mann, after all. One last thing about this bravado angle is that it applies to the characters, but also maybe to the movie itself. Like I said, this is a hyper-violent movie. Look, bank robberies are violent. The modern world is violent, I guess. I wouldn't say the movie stylizes violence in the way that something like Kingsman does, but maybe it lavishes in its grittiness in some ways, right? Maybe the violence makes it is some sort of mark of legitimacy. That's a slightly perverse thought. I think some people are drawn to Heat because of how extreme it is. I'm not sure that's quite the right thing to seek out, but when I first saw Heat, that probably was one of the reasons it made such a big impression on me. This movie is a sledgehammer. That might be its main virtue, and it's not just the violence. This is an emotionally gripping movie with tons of tension. It will shred your nerves, leave you curled up in the fetal position. I didn't really know that movies could do that until I saw Heat. I think that's the clearest virtue of the film, is just how much of an experience it is, how much of a sledgehammer it is. On the flip side, if there's a vice here, well, maybe you could say, what's the point? This definitely is not the sort of movie that I would be interested in watching these days, I guess. But it's hard to argue that it's not an incredible film. So if the movie, did I just call it pointless? Well, not really, but a little bit. Does that mean that there's not going to be anything interesting to talk about, though? No. There's some themes that creep in that I think are kind of cool. The first thing I want to talk about is the image of the city and transportation. I hear myself saying that, and it sounds kind of obvious. This movie starts on a train and ends at an airport. People love talking about urbanism these days, and in the 80s and the 90s, the city and the networks within the city, the highways, featured prominently a lot of postmodern discourse. Pacino describes his apartment as postmodern crap at one point, I think. I don't want to read into this stuff too much. Like I said, it feels a little obvious. But I like how the beginning and the end are kind of liminal. The train and the airport, with Neil drifting in and out of the story, the audience drifting in and out of the story. Of course, this is Los Angeles, so most of the story happens on the street, on the road. This movie was filmed almost entirely on location, I think. All of the crimes in this movie involve cars, especially the first one, where the tow truck, the friend of the car, Shirley, the hero of the cars, turns on them. There are a bunch of scenes under the highways where the action is framed by a swath of on-ramps and overpasses. Interestingly, though, you never really see any traffic in this movie. I don't quite know what to make of this, but I'll come back to it maybe. Possibly we turn to Cronenberg here. Heat has a fairly impersonal, almost estranged view of Los Angeles. It's also really metallic. The music, the lighting, it's metallic. Neil is reading a book about titanium at one point, right? This stuff kind of reminds me of Crash, the old Crash. I'm not going to go overboard here, but it's no surprise they came out within 1 year of each other. Let me put it that way. Another big theme in this movie is simultaneity. And this is all over the place. The movie opens with a really nice parallel construction. You see the different member of Neil's crew coming together. Throughout the movie, Pacino and De Niro are parallel, of course. There are a lot of things that are going to happen at the same time. The police are going to be surveilling everything, watching over everybody, sending back this simultaneous information through some kind of urban nervous system. Even the song at the end, God Moving Over the Face of the Water, or whatever it's called, has these sort of stacked arpeggios in it that kind of invoke simultaneity as well. The music here really reminds me of the other Crash, actually, which is a score by Mark Isham. This is Elliot Goldenthal in this movie. I think Moby did the final song. Anyway, similar music. Of course, that Crash is also all about simultaneity, about people affecting each other in an urban life, all these urban lives being linked together. So some similar ideas here. Heat also does have a little bit of a racial angle to it. It's not particularly moralistic. Maybe some of these moments feel a little bit dated just because of the lingo. Otherwise, I don't quite know what to make of them. I think it's not a deeply incisive look at race, urban life, and crime, but there's something there. Heat has a number of interesting shots of the city from above, either via helicopter or hill or crane. Some of these look pretty weird. One of the helicopter shots almost looks like tilt-shift photography, where the lens makes the city look like some kind of toy. When Neil and Edie are overlooking the city, you can see the lights in the background. It looks interesting. You don't see the buildings. Los Angeles looks more like some kind of glowing circuit board. Again, maybe we have some kind of idea of simultaneity here, some hint of technology. I don't want to go overboard. Still, it's sort of impersonal. You see the city, but you kind of don't see the people. There are people in this movie, of course. When the bank is robbed, for instance, there are a bunch of people outside of it going about their lives. This is simultaneity. They're, in the middle of something. Then the wives of the robbers are going to see the news on television, right? We're going to see these shots of them in their various houses. One of them is in a bar, watching the TV in a bar, and she's heartbroken, but nobody else seems to care very much. So simultaneous, but also isolated and impersonal. Simultaneous, impersonal. It's like this huge metal beehive of activity. I don't know. This is an interesting way to look at the modern or the postmodern city, right? As being a place with all these things going on at once, and yet a place that is quite isolated, a place that's where it's difficult to connect with much of anyone. Heat is a movie of undersides and exteriors, I think. Crime itself is kind of an underside, the underworld. These are crimes against secret infrastructure, the bank truck, which operates on a certain timetable, the Platinum Depot. Most people don't even know what these things are, these sort of cycles, the money being pumped in and out of the bank, right, for the payroll. Neil has, and his cronies, they have this sort of secret knowledge, the secret view of the city, of the underground, of the exteriors, right? I don't think Heat is a super opinionated movie, but it puts forward a particular image of a city and maybe an odd sort of escapism, too. Neil and Vincent talk about being separate from the rat race, but they still seem to be living in the sewer, maybe. And I don't know, is this some sort of prophecy for what modern, postmodern city life is going to be like, this feeling of isolation, and a feeling that you live almost in a war zone? It's sort of a grim look, but I think that's one of the undertones of the film. Heat, the first time I watched it, like I said, I hadn't realized that movies could be so intense, that they could be so moving, so gripping. I remember I had a soccer game the day after I watched the film, and I was distracted during the game. I was still thinking about the movie from the night before. Nothing had ever gripped me like that. When I watched it this time, honestly, I think it affected me even more. I could barely get through this movie because of how gripping it is, how tense it is. And that's pretty amazing. On this channel, I focus a lot on this more serious social drama stuff, psychological realism, and this movie, in many ways, is not that at all. But the second half of it, in some ways, actually does feel a little bit like some of the movies we would talk about more frequently. I don't think it has the same kind of psychological detail as a lot of movies I like, but it does feel maybe just as powerful, maybe more powerful. And like I said, that is probably this film's main virtue, is just that it is a powerful movie, probably one of the most powerful to have ever been made. And given that, and given the state that it will leave you in after you finish watching it, it's hard to fault it.